November 28, 1944, 02:10 hours, the port of Antwerp, Belgium. The rain is cold and relentless, a miserable North Sea drizzle that seems to seep into the very soul. It turns the docks into a slick, black mirror, reflecting the harsh glare of floodlights that cut through the pre-dawn gloom. Here, amidst the groan of cranes and the hiss of steam winches, Corporal John Kowalski of the U.S. Army Transportation Corps leans against a crate that smells of pine and greaseproof paper. He's been awake for 22 hours. In his hand, a crumpled letter from his wife, Mary, back in Ohio. Her words, written 3 weeks ago, speak of a world away, of rationing stamps, of their son taking his first steps, of planting a victory garden. It's a fragile piece of paper in a world of steel, wood, and canvas. He reads the same line for the 10th time. Are you staying warm, my love? I pray you have what you need. He almost laughs. He looks up from the letter, his eyes scanning the panorama of organized chaos. What they need is being unloaded around him in staggering, almost obscene quantities. A mountain of 105mm artillery shells, each stenciled with white lettering, sits under a vast tarpaulin. Beyond it, a forest of spare tank treads stacked like metallic cordwood. Winches scream as they hoist another M4 Sherman tank from the hold of the SS Samuel Gorton, a Liberty ship that didn't even exist 6 months ago. It swings through the air, dripping seawater, a 30-ton pendulum of American industrial might, before being gently lowered onto the quay. This single ship is one of dozens in the harbor tonight, and this harbor is one of several now feeding the Allied war machine in Europe. From where Kowalski stands, he can see endless rows of GMC deuce-and-a-half trucks, their fuel tanks being topped off, ready to join the roaring artery of supplies heading for the front. They are the blood cells of this army, and he is just one of many ensuring the circulation never stops. To a man like Kowalski, who grew up during the Great Depression, this sheer volume of stuff is hard to comprehend. He remembers soup lines, not production lines. He remembers scarcity, not surplus. Now he is a gatekeeper for a flood tide of material that defies belief. Every crate of K-rations, every box of .30 caliber ammunition, every 5-gallon jerry can of gasoline is a testament to something a world away. A promise made in Detroit, forged in Pittsburgh, and assembled in factories from coast to coast. And it is a promise the enemy never believed could be kept. 4 years earlier, the leader of the Third Reich had dismissed America as a mongrel society, a nation of decadent jazz music and consumerist distractions, incapable of the discipline of total war. Its industry, he sneered, was built for cars and refrigerators, not for panzers and Stukas. He was certain that the vast Atlantic Ocean, prowled by his U-boat wolf packs, would be an insurmountable barrier. He was certain the lifeline could be cut, but here in the cold rain of a Belgian port, the lie of that certainty is laid bare. The lifeline was not cut. It has become a deluge, and Corporal Kowalski, his shoulders aching and his eyes burning from exhaustion, knows a simple, profound truth the German High Command is just now beginning to understand. The war is not just being fought on the front lines. It is being won here, on these docks, by a wave of material so immense, so relentless, that it will drown a continent in steel. The mockery has fallen silent, replaced by the roar of an engine. The roar of a nation awakening. Before the first GI set foot in North Africa, before the first bomber took off from an English airfield, the war for Europe was being waged in the minds of industrialists, engineers, and one determined president. In a fireside chat on December 29, 1940, with Britain standing alone and the swastika flying over Paris, Franklin D. Roosevelt articulated a revolutionary concept. America, while still officially neutral, must become the great arsenal of democracy. It was not a call to arms, but a call to the assembly line. This was a grand strategic gamble, a declaration that the American economy could outproduce the combined military-industrial complexes of Germany, Italy, and Japan. To the Axis powers, it seemed absurd. The United States was just emerging from the deepest economic depression in its history. Its army was smaller than Portugal's, equipped with outdated M2 tanks and bolt-action Springfield rifles. The nation was fiercely isolationist, scarred by the memory of World War I. But beneath the surface lay a dormant power of unparalleled scale. The same industrial base that had put an automobile in every middle-class driveway possessed the latent capacity for mass production that European strategists, accustomed to bespoke, craft-based manufacturing, simply could not grasp. The challenge was to pivot this entire consumer-driven economy toward a single unified purpose, the machinery of war. The transformation was breathtaking in its speed and scale. The Chrysler Corporation, famous for its DeSoto and Plymouth cars, was handed the plans for a medium tank. They didn't just build a factory, they built the Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant, a government-owned Chrysler-operated behemoth that, by 1942, was producing more tanks in a month than all of Germany. The M4 Sherman, though often outgunned by German Panthers and Tigers, was designed not just for combat, but for production. With its standardized parts and relatively simple construction, it could be churned out by the tens of thousands. Far more audacious was Henry Ford's Willow Run facility in Michigan. Ford, a man who had perfected the assembly line for the Model T, promised to apply the same principles to the B-24 Liberator, a complex four-engine heavy bomber with over 1.2 million parts. Military experts scoffed, claiming a plane was not a car. Yet by 1944, Willow Run was a mile-long factory with its own airfield, a city unto itself, rolling a finished B-24 off the line every 63 minutes. This miracle of production extended to the sea. The critical link was the ocean-going cargo vessel. German U-boats were sinking Allied shipping at a catastrophic rate. Britain was facing starvation. The answer was the Liberty ship, a stark, functional, and deeply unbeautiful vessel. Based on a British design, it was simplified for mass production. Sections were prefabricated in factories across the country and then welded together in shipyards, a faster, stronger method than traditional riveting. Industrialist Henry J. Kaiser, who had never built a ship before, applied assembly line techniques. The average build time for a Liberty ship dropped from 230 days to just 42. One vessel, the SS Robert E. Peary, was famously assembled in 4 days and 15 hours as a publicity stunt. By the end of the war, over 2,700 of these floating warehouses had been launched, a bridge of ships spanning the Atlantic. The numbers were the language of this new warfare. Over 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, nearly 200,000 artillery pieces, 4 million military trucks, 6.5 million rifles, and crucially, 488,000 tons of aircraft bombs. But this torrent of steel had to cross 3,000 miles of the most dangerous water in the world, the North Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic became the linchpin of the entire Allied strategy. If the convoys could not get through, the arsenal would rust in American ports and Europe would be lost. The convoy system was a brutal calculus of survival. Dozens of merchant ships, laden with everything from fuel to food, would steam in a vast, vulnerable grid, protected by a thin screen of warships. Royal Navy corvettes, Flower-class ships that were barely more than armed trawlers, rolled violently in the Atlantic swell. American destroyers, with their superior speed and advanced sonar, what the British called ASDIC, hunted for the faint echo of a submerged steel hull. The strategy was purely defensive, get the cargo to port. But the cost was immense, paid in fire, freezing water, and the lives of the men of the merchant marine. The German wolf packs, coordinated by radio from Admiral Karl Dönitz's headquarters, would stalk the convoys, waiting for nightfall to strike. The war for Europe's liberation would first have to be won in the black, icy depths of the Atlantic. The statistics of the arsenal of democracy are staggering, but they obscure the human cost and effort that underpinned every number. This was a war won by individuals, by millions of ordinary people whose collective will fueled the machine. Their perspectives, from the factory floor to the freighter's deck, formed the true narrative of this logistical triumph. In Detroit, the air hummed with a different kind of energy. Women who had been homemakers or secretaries a year earlier now wore overalls and safety goggles, their hands once used to kneading dough, now expertly operating rivet guns and welding torches. They were the Rosie the Riveters, the iconic face of the home front. For them, the war was not a distant headline. It was the deafening clang of the factory, the smell of hot metal, the 12-hour shift, and the constant nagging fear for a husband, a brother, or a son overseas. Each finished engine part, each perfectly aligned wing spar, was a prayer sent across the ocean. It was a tangible connection to the fight, a way of protecting their loved ones with every piece of steel they shaped. Thousands of miles away, on the turbulent waters of the Atlantic, the men of the merchant marine lived a life of sustained tension. They were civilians, yet they faced combat risks as great as any soldier. Aboard a Liberty ship like the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, the routine was monotonous, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. The lookout's cry of "torpedo track to starboard" could shatter the calm in an instant. There was no foxhole to dive into, only the cold, unforgiving ocean. They watched sister ships in the convoy erupt in a flash of orange flame, knowing their own vessel, laden with thousands of tons of high-octane aviation fuel or high explosives, could be next. The sound of a U-boat being hunted by a destroyer's depth charges, a deep, resonating thump that vibrated through the hull, was both a sound of hope and a reminder of the unseen predator lurking below. These men, often too old or unfit for military service, were the unsung heroes who delivered the tools of war, knowing that their own survival depended on the thin gray hulls of the naval escorts. Once the supplies reached the ports of Britain, a new army took over, the Quartermaster Corps. In massive depots across southern England, men like Sergeant Frank Papa sorted, catalogued, and stacked a universe of material. It was a Herculean task of organization. An infantry division in combat consumed over 600 tons of supplies per day. Every item had a designation from ammunition Cal 30, ball M2, to plasma, blood, normal, human, dried. They managed mountains of boots, forests of rifles, lakes of gasoline. Their war was a battle against chaos, fought with clipboards and forklifts. They understood in a way the frontline soldier could not, the sheer logistical weight of a modern army. They knew that a stalled truck or a mislabeled crate could mean the difference between victory and defeat for a unit hundreds of miles away. This human chain, stretching from the iron mines of Minnesota to the muddy supply dumps of Normandy, was America's true secret weapon. It wasn't just the capacity to produce. It was the ingenuity and resilience of the people who made the system work. A factory worker modifying a jig to save 3 seconds per unit, a merchant captain zigzagging at precisely the right moment, a quartermaster devising a better way to load a truck. These were the small, unrecorded acts of victory that, when multiplied by millions, created an unstoppable force. The Nazi worldview was built on a foundation of profound arrogance, a belief in the inherent superiority of the Aryan race, and the unshakable will of the German state. From this ideological high ground, Adolf Hitler and his high command looked across the Atlantic at the United States with a mixture of bewilderment and contempt. They saw a nation they fundamentally misunderstood, and this miscalculation would prove to be one of their most fatal errors. In their eyes, America was not a serious military power. It was a Judaized and negrified society, a chaotic melting pot of races lacking the purity and martial spirit of the German Volk. In a 1942 speech, Hitler proclaimed, "What is America but a decayed country? A country with a population of which half is Negroid and the other half is Jewish." This racial prejudice blinded them to the nation's true strengths. They interpreted American consumer culture, its love of jazz, Hollywood films and automobiles as proof of a soft, decadent people incapable of the sacrifice and discipline required for total war. This disdain filtered down through the military command. German officers, products of a rigid professional Prussian military tradition, looked at the small, inexperienced American army of 1941 and saw an amateur force. They believed that even if America could produce weapons, it could not produce soldiers capable of using them effectively against the battle-hardened Wehrmacht. Strategically, their entire plan to keep America out of the European war rested on one key assumption, that the Atlantic could be made an impassable barrier. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, the brilliant and obsessive commander of the U-boat force, Befehlshaber der U-Boote, promised Hitler he could sever the Allied lifeline. His strategy was brutally simple: the tonnage war. He calculated that if his U-boats could sink merchant ships faster than the Allies could build them, Great Britain would be starved of food, fuel, and weapons, forcing it to sue for peace. America's industrial production would be irrelevant if it could never reach the battlefield. For a time, the strategy appeared to be working with terrifying success. During the first happy time in 1940-41, U-boat aces like Otto Kretschmer and Günther Prien became national heroes in Germany, sinking ships with near impunity. When America entered the war in December 1941, Dönitz launched Operation Drumbeat, Paukenschlag, sending his U-boats to the undefended east coast of the United States. In what became the second happy time, German submariners were shocked by the lack of preparation. Coastal cities remained brightly lit, providing perfect silhouettes for tankers and freighters. For months, U-boats sank ships within sight of American shores, turning the waters from Florida to Newfoundland into Torpedo Alley. This early success solidified the German belief in their strategy. They saw the mounting Allied losses, over 650,000 tons of shipping sunk in January 1943 alone, as proof that the tonnage war was being won. They failed to appreciate the sheer scale of the American response. While they focused on the number of ships sunk, they ignored the exponential growth in the number of ships being launched. They saw the success of their elite U-boat crews, but underestimated the Allied ability to innovate, developing new technologies like centimetric radar, high-frequency direction finding, Huff-Duff, and long-range patrol bombers that would systematically dismantle the Wolfpack's advantages. The German intelligence apparatus, the Abwehr, consistently failed to provide an accurate picture of American industrial mobilization. Reports that reached Berlin about factories producing a bomber an hour were often dismissed as outlandish propaganda. They were trapped by their own ideology, unable to conceive that a mongrel nation of individualists could organize itself for such a colossal, unified effort. They believed in the superiority of their technology, the quality of their training, and the indomitable will of their Führer. They could not imagine being defeated by something as mundane as logistics. They could not imagine being drowned by a simple flood of mass-produced, standardized, unglamorous stuff. The theoretical power of the arsenal of democracy was meaningless until it was tested in the crucible of combat. The turning point came not in one single battle, but in a series of brutal, interconnected struggles where logistical might was translated into decisive action, forever changing the enemy's perception of the war. The first and most vital arena was the Atlantic. By the spring of 1943, the tonnage war had reached its bloody climax. Admiral Dönitz, confident in his Wolfpacks, threw everything he had at the Allied convoys. One of the most critical engagements was the battle for Convoy ONS-5 in late April and early May. This slow-moving, 43-ship convoy, bound for North America from the UK, was savaged by a concentration of over 40 U-boats. The weather was horrific, with gale-force winds scattering the ships. For 6 days, a desperate battle raged. U-boats struck at night, firing torpedoes and then crash-diving to escape the escorts. The convoy's small screen of British, Polish, and Canadian warships fought back with grim determination. Depth charges thundered, sending plumes of water erupting from the gray sea. It was a chaotic, confused melee fought in near-total darkness, punctuated by the flash of explosions and the faint signals of ships in distress. 12 merchant ships were lost. But something had changed. The escorts, now better equipped with shipborne radar that could detect a surfaced U-boat at night, and supported by long-range B-24 Liberators flying from Iceland and Newfoundland, fought back with a new ferocity. They sank 6 U-boats and damaged 7 more, forcing Dönitz to call off the attack. May 1943, which began so promisingly for the Germans, became Black May, a month in which they lost 41 U-boats. The hunter had become the hunted. The combination of technology, tactics, and sheer numbers of escort vessels, many of them American-built destroyer escorts, had tipped the balance. The Atlantic lifeline was secure. The floodgates were open. 1 year later, on June 6, 1944, the world witnessed the ultimate expression of this logistical power. Operation Neptune, the D-Day landings. The German defenders in Normandy peered out from their concrete bunkers and saw a sight that defied imagination. The horizon was not water. It was a solid wall of ships. Over 5,000 vessels, from battleships to landing craft, choked the English Channel. This was not just an invasion. It was the physical transportation of an entire industrial nation onto a hostile shore. But the most audacious feat was what came after the initial assault. The Allies knew they needed a functioning deep-water port to supply their armies, and Cherbourg would take weeks to capture and clear. Their solution was something the Germans had considered and dismissed as impossible. They brought their own harbors with them. The Mulberry Harbors, vast artificial ports made of sunken concrete caissons and floating piers, were towed across the channel and assembled off Omaha and Gold Beaches. It was an engineering marvel on a scale never before seen, allowing thousands of tons of supplies to be unloaded daily, bypassing the need for a traditional port. At the same time, Operation Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, laid a flexible pipeline on the seabed, pumping fuel directly from England to France, eliminating the need for vulnerable tankers. As the Allied armies broke out of the Normandy hedgerows in late summer, they faced a new crisis. Their advance was so rapid that the supply lines, still based in Normandy, were stretched to the breaking point. General George S. Patton's Third Army was literally running out of gas. The solution was a remarkable feat of improvisation and endurance, the Red Ball Express. This was a massive one-way, non-stop truck convoy system that ran 24 hours a day. The vast majority of the drivers were African American soldiers from segregated transportation and quartermaster units. For 82 consecutive days, they drove their GMC trucks through dust, mud, and rain, often under the threat of enemy aircraft or snipers. They removed the governors from their engines to gain a few extra miles per hour, drove with headlights off at night, and slept in their cabs. They were the lifeblood of the advance, delivering an average of 12,500 tons of supplies to the front every single day. They were the final critical link in the chain that began in a Detroit factory. The Red Ball Express proved that the American logistical tail was not just long. It was fast, flexible, and utterly relentless. For the common German Lanzer on the Western Front, the war changed fundamentally after D-Day. The fight in the East against the Soviet Union had been a brutal, attritional struggle against a numerically superior foe. But this was different. This was a war against an abstract inhuman force, the force of production. The psychological impact began with the sheer volume of Allied artillery. German soldiers, veterans of many campaigns, wrote letters home describing the Materialschlacht, the Battle of Material, in tones of awe and despair. A single American infantry division possessed more organic artillery firepower than a German panzer division. Pre-attack bombardments would last for hours, a ceaseless rolling thunder that pulverized defenses and shattered nerves. One German general famously remarked, "In Russia I was afraid of the man. In the West I was afraid of his materiel. It felt less like fighting an army, and more like trying to hold back an avalanche of high explosives." This sense of being overwhelmed was reinforced by what they saw in the sky. The constant presence of Allied fighter bombers, P-47 Thunderbolts and Hawker Typhoons, paralyzed German movement during the day. A single German truck, a lone tank, or a column of marching infantry would be pounced upon by swarms of aircraft. The Luftwaffe, decimated by fuel shortages and losses, was nowhere to be seen. This absolute air supremacy meant that the Wehrmacht was blind, immobile, and exposed. When German troops did manage to capture American positions or personnel, the shock deepened. They discovered the quality and quantity of American rations. While the German soldier subsisted on coarse bread, sausage, and thin soup, he found his American counterpart possessed canned meats, vegetables, chocolate, coffee, and cigarettes. It was a small detail, but it spoke volumes about the economic disparity between the two nations. The American army fought on a full stomach. Even more demoralizing was the enemy's ability to replace losses. When German gunners knocked out an M4 Sherman tank, they felt a brief sense of victory. But their satisfaction evaporated when they saw 2 more Shermans arrive the next day to take its place. Germany, by contrast, could not replace its losses. Every destroyed Tiger or Panther tank was a near irreplaceable asset, the product of painstaking, resource-intensive manufacturing. The Americans treated their tanks, trucks, and even planes as expendable commodities. They were fighting a war of attrition, and they had a bottomless inventory. At the highest levels of the German state, the reality had sunk in, even if it was never publicly admitted. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister for Armaments and War Production, was a technocrat who understood the cold arithmetic of war. He saw the American production figures and knew the cause was hopeless. In his post-war memoirs, he wrote, "The superiority of the enemy in the air and in materiel was so overwhelming that our troops were simply crushed." He understood that Germany, for all its vaunted efficiency and technological prowess, was being buried. The precision of a Krupp steel cannon was no match for the sheer, unrelenting quantity of 1,000 guns made by Chrysler and Ford. The initial mockery and ideological contempt had curdled into a grim, unspoken understanding. The decadent, materialistic society they had so derided had turned its greatest strength, its mastery of mass production and consumer logistics, into the ultimate weapon of war. The German war machine, which had blitzed its way across Europe, was now being methodically, inexorably, ground into dust by the unbearable weight of American industry. The vast disparity in material resources created 2 profoundly different psychological environments for the soldiers on opposing sides. For the American GI, this environment fostered a unique kind of confidence, while for the German Lancer, it bred a deep and corrosive fatalism. The American soldier was the best-equipped fighting man in the world, and he knew it. This wasn't just about having the best rifle or the thickest armor. It was about the entire ecosystem of support that surrounded him. He knew that if he was wounded, there was a high probability that a medic with penicillin and blood plasma would reach him quickly. He knew that warm food delivered by truck was a regular occurrence, not a luxury. He knew that if his company's machine guns fired 10,000 rounds in a firefight, a new supply would be waiting for them by morning. This logistical certainty had a profound effect on tactics and morale. American commanders could be prodigal with firepower. Why risk soldiers' lives in a frontal assault on a fortified house when you can call in an artillery strike and simply level it? This willingness to substitute shells for bodies, while sometimes criticized as tactically unsubtle, undoubtedly saved countless American lives and created a sense of operational security. The GI developed a kind of swagger, an almost casual belief in the inevitability of victory. It wasn't arrogance in his own abilities so much as an unshakable faith in the system backing him up. The ubiquitous Jeep, the rugged GMC truck, the ever-present C-47 transport plane. These were symbols of a power that felt limitless. For the German soldier, the psychological landscape was the polar opposite. He was living in a world of constant scarcity. By 1944, fuel was so heavily rationed that panzer divisions often had to be transported by rail to conserve it, making them vulnerable to air attack. Elite units like the Panzer Lehr Division went into the Battle of the Bulge with only a fraction of their authorized fuel and ammunition. Soldiers were constantly forced to cannibalize broken-down vehicles for spare parts. The magnificent Tiger tank was a fearsome weapon, but it was a maintenance nightmare. And a broken transmission could effectively kill it, as spare parts might be weeks away, if they came at all. This constant improvisation and making do bred a grim, weary resilience, but it also fostered a sense of hopelessness. How could you win a war when your enemy could afford to pave roads as they advanced, while you had to rely on horse-drawn carts to bring up your dwindling supplies? The German soldier's world shrank. His primary concerns became survival, finding food, conserving ammunition, and praying he wouldn't attract the attention of the ever-present J-bows, Allied fighter bombers. The ultimate psychological blow was the realization that the war was asymmetrical. The Germans felt they were engaged in a desperate existential struggle, while for the Americans, it seemed to be a problem of industrial management. The German soldier fought with the knowledge that defeat meant the destruction of his homeland. The American soldier fought with the knowledge that a factory 4,000 miles away was already building his replacement equipment. This fundamental difference in perspective created a deep chasm in morale. While the American GI looked forward with confidence, the German Lancer could only look over his shoulder at the ever-advancing, ever-growing logistical tide that was about to engulf him. The logistical dominance of the Allies was the decisive factor in the final campaigns of the war in Europe. The Battle of the Bulge in the winter of 1944 was Germany's last great gamble, a desperate attempt to punch through the American lines and capture the vital port of Antwerp, thereby splitting the Allied armies and cutting their supply lines. The initial German attack, achieved through surprise and local superiority, was devastating, but the offensive ultimately failed not for a lack of fighting spirit, but for a lack of fuel. The armored spearheads of Kampfgruppe Peiper literally ran out of gas just miles from their objectives on the Meuse River. The American response was a logistical masterpiece. General Patton famously wheeled his entire Third Army 90 degrees to the north, attacking the southern flank of the German salient. This maneuver, audacious in its speed and scale, was only possible because his quartermasters could supply the tens of thousands of gallons of fuel and tons of ammunition required to sustain the attack. At the besieged town of Bastogne, the surrounded 101st Airborne Division was kept alive and fighting by C-47s, which flew in supplies and ammunition day after day as soon as the weather cleared. The Battle of the Bulge was ultimately won by the side that could move and supply its forces more effectively. It was a victory for the Red Ball Express and the transport plane as much as it was for the infantryman in his foxhole. In the spring of 1945, as the Allies crossed the Rhine and poured into the heart of Germany, the Wehrmacht effectively ceased to exist as a cohesive fighting force. It disintegrated into scattered pockets of resistance, starved of supplies and mobility. Allied armies, by contrast, advanced with a seemingly endless logistical tale, their engineering units building bridges over bombed-out rivers in a matter of hours, their supply trucks clogging every road. The final conquest of the Third Reich was less a series of battles and more a massive mopping-up operation, enabled by overwhelming material superiority. The cost of creating this arsenal and delivering it was steep. Over 9,000 men of the U.S. Merchant Marine perished in the Atlantic and other seas, a casualty rate higher than any branch of the U.S. military except the Marine Corps. The drivers of the Red Ball Express faced constant danger and crippling exhaustion. The workers on the home front endured long hours and industrial accidents. This victory was purchased with treasure, sweat, and blood, far from the front lines. In the final analysis, Hitler's mockery of America was rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of power in the 20th century. He believed power grew from ideological purity, racial supremacy, and martial will. He failed to grasp that modern warfare was, at its core, a contest of industrial capacity, resource management, and logistics. He saw a nation of shopkeepers and car salesmen and missed the reality. A nation that had perfected the art of making and moving things on an unprecedented scale. The legacy of the arsenal of democracy is profound. It not only won the Second World War but also reshaped the global order, establishing the United States as the world's preeminent economic and military power. It demonstrated that the collective will of a free, democratic society, when mobilized, could generate a force more powerful than any totalitarian regime. The war was won by the courage of soldiers, the brilliance of commanders, and the sacrifice of nations. But it was enabled, sustained, and ultimately guaranteed by the unglamorous, unending, and overwhelming flood of material that poured from the factories and shipyards of America. The derisive laughter from Berlin was silenced, not by a single gunshot, but by the relentless, deafening roar of 1,000,000 engines, a sound that signaled the doom of one world and the dawn of another.